Today marks my 80th birthday, and seeing my descendants kneeling before me fills my heart with immense joy. Although we share no blood relation, I have grown quite fond of them. Sitting to my right is my old man, 2 years my senior. Even at this age, he remains sharp and upright, a truly handsome elder. My life, though steeped in hardship during the early years, turned sweet as honey once I met my husband. If there is any regret, it is that I never bore him a child. We did adopt his comrade's son, who is both filial and accomplished, but I still yearn for a soft, sweet daughter. After the birthday celebration, I was utterly exhausted but content. My husband even indulged me with 2 pieces of braised pork, large chunks at that. At our age, such indulgences are rare, making life feel somewhat constrained. The next morning, I awoke with severe stomach pain, as if a knife were twisting inside me. How could this be from just a piece of meat? I felt utterly powerless, unable to move.
Is anyone there? David! David, my stomach hurts.
The voice that came out startled me. It was too young. In that moment, I forgot my pain and looked at my hands. They were no longer wrinkled like old tree bark, but full and elastic. I glanced around and realized I wasn't in my beloved rosewood bed but on a simple cot in a dilapidated room. Where was I? Seeing my swollen belly, I was stunned. I was about to give birth. On the table, a photo of my husband and me in our youth caught my eye. It seemed I had traveled back 60 years. I remembered this difficult period. Michael had been missing for over 6 months, and the army reported he had perished while pursuing criminals. His older brother demanded the family be split, and after the division, the Johnson family abandoned me. Pregnant and alone, the grief of Michael's loss led to a difficult labor, nearly costing me my life. Though I survived, I was left unable to have more children. Whether this was a dream or reality, my sole aim was to save the child within me. The Johnson family had sent me to this old house, isolated from others. In my past life, I was rescued the next morning, too late for proper care. This time, I was determined to save myself. I crawled to the door, desperate for help, and saw Sarah coming with supplies.
Sarah, get help. I'm about to give birth.
Wait here, I'll get Mrs. Thompson.
My heart sank. Shouldn't I be taken to a hospital? Then I remembered, this was 60 years ago, and home births were common. I glanced at the low, damp house. Was I really going to give birth here? My husband had ensured I was well cared for in my later years, living in luxury. Now, I was back in this era of scarcity, starting over. Pregnant and alone, the grief of Michael's loss led to a difficult labor, nearly costing my life. Although I survived, I was left unable to have more children. Whether this was a dream or reality, my sole aim was to save the child within me. The Johnson family had sent me to this old house, isolated from others. In my past life, I was rescued the next morning, too late for proper care. This time, I was determined to save myself. I crawled to the door, desperate for help, and saw Sarah coming with supplies.
Sarah, get help. I'm about to give birth.
Wait here, I'll get Mrs. Thompson.
My heart sank. Shouldn't I be taken to a hospital? Then I remembered, this was 60 years ago, and home births were common. I glanced at the low, damp house. Was I really going to give birth here? I remember in my previous life, I woke up to the hospital telling me I had given birth to a girl. I had even seen the little girl's lifeless body, covered in blood, which haunted my nightmares.
Could it be that I haven't returned to the past? But everything and everyone around me matched perfectly. Could this be some parallel universe?
In my later years, influenced by the younger generation, I became fascinated with novels and learned about parallel universes. Is the old man in my life still the same person? Looking at the boy in my arms, a strange emotion surged in my chest. This is the continuation of my life. Whether this is my past life or not, I am grateful for the chance to live again. I rested at Mrs. Thompson's house for 3 days. During this time, she took good care of me, likely because of the gold bracelet. The Johnson family never visited once during this period. Once I could get out of bed, I returned to my place. I dug out the gold bracelet from under the bed and gave it to Mrs. Thompson. These items were left to me by my late grandmother. In my previous life, I never sold them, even in the hardest times, because they were the last memories of my only relative.
This time, I realized that if my grandmother were still alive, she would want me to use what she left me to get through tough times.
Dragging my weak body, I cleaned the room a bit and checked the dwindling food supply in the rice jar. I remembered Sarah was supposed to bring me some things, but she hadn't delivered them yet. Why didn't she call for help? What exactly happened? Although I wanted to find Sarah, my body was too weak to go looking for her. I ate a simple dinner with some eggs Mrs. Thompson had left me and went to bed. The next morning, I woke up to see my lively son. I remembered that in my previous life, David returned 2 months later. I wondered if things would change this time. At noon, Sarah finally came over, bringing the things I had asked her to get. She explained that she had fallen and fainted on her way to find the midwife and had just recovered from her injuries. I noticed her evasive eyes and knew she was lying. I had always treated Sarah well, giving her benefits whenever I asked her to run errands. I never expected her to ignore me in my time of need. It was just after the economic reforms, and everyone was struggling. Buying things required not just money but also ration tickets. I looked at the items Sarah had bought, some fabric and some rice and flour. It had been so long that I couldn't remember how many tickets and how much money I had given her.
Is there any money left?
Oh, my memory. There's some money left. I'll get it for you.
I took the money from her, feeling a sense of satisfaction at her pained expression. I tried to recall Sarah's fate in my previous life. She had married David's brother. Because she was my sister-in-law and friend, I had taken good care of her. Now I realized that the Johnson family and Sarah were not as simple as I had thought. After a brief conversation, I saw her off without giving her anything. Although I couldn't blame her for my difficult childbirth, I decided at that moment that I wanted no further association with her. Pregnant and alone, the grief of Michael's loss led to a difficult labor, nearly costing me my life. Though I survived, I was left unable to have more children. Whether this was a dream or reality, my sole aim was to save the child within me. The Johnson family had sent me to this old house, isolated from others. In my past life, I was rescued the next morning, too late for proper care. This time, I was determined to save myself. I crawled to the door, desperate for help, and saw Sarah coming with supplies.
Sarah, get help. I'm about to give birth.
Sarah panicked at my state.
Wait here, I'll get Mrs. Thompson.
My heart sank. Shouldn't I be taken to a hospital? Then I remembered this was 60 years ago, and home births were common. I glanced at the low, damp house. Was I really going to give birth here? My husband had ensured I was well cared for in my later years, living in luxury. Now, I was back in this era of scarcity, starting over.
Margaret, if you treat me like this, aren't you afraid David will come back and settle the score with you?
After living so many years, I couldn't believe I was being bested by a few ordinary villagers. I had been too well protected by my old man.
David is long gone. His compensation is about to be distributed.
I knew it. They kept causing me trouble and even convinced Mrs. Thompson not to assist with my delivery because they feared I would share David's compensation with my child. At that moment, I seemed to hear the cry of a child.
Let go of me! I didn't steal anyone's man!
Linda, you can tell them you and he are in love. David is no longer with us, and it's normal for you to find someone new.
I glanced at the repulsive man, who gave me a leering smile. I almost vomited, but to survive, this seemed like my only option. The child's cries grew louder, and I became more confused. If I really got together with this vagrant, would David understand my predicament if he returned to this world? But at this moment, I had no choice. Just as I was about to agree, my door was flung open. A man, gaunt but exuding a chilling aura, emerged holding the child.
The child is hungry.
Then, with cold eyes, he scanned the people in the yard.
Are you a man or a ghost?
What do you think? Mother, even if I were a ghost, seeing you treat my wife like this, I would crawl out of hell to find you.
Upon hearing this, Margaret fainted. The other members of the Johnson family were trembling with fear.
You should have let us know you were back. We misunderstood.
With my husband at home, they had no reason to suspect me of infidelity.
This time, I was severely injured and was resting inside. I was just woken up.
The villagers, led by the mayor, prepared to leave.
Wait, are we just going to let them off for falsely accusing me?
Seeing my protector had arrived, I began to show off, just like in my previous life.
You did it on purpose. You didn't tell us your husband was back, causing us to misunderstand.
I did it on purpose. You falsely accused me of infidelity. I can also say you were meeting this man, and I just happened to catch you, so you framed me.
You're slandering me. How could I be with a man like that?
You already have a child, and you still deny it? Tell them, were you here to meet Sarah, or were you here to steal?
I was here for a rendezvous.
He then pulled out a handkerchief with Sarah's name embroidered on it. I couldn't believe this person had something so personal of Sarah's.
You're lying.
If you don't believe me, have Sarah go to the hospital for a checkup.
In her previous life, her child was born prematurely and looked so healthy that it sparked a lot of gossip. I calculated the dates. Around this time, Sarah should be expecting David's brother's child.
You're slandering me.
She then ran off in a panic. The people in the courtyard, seeing the main character had fled, dragged the man with yellow teeth away. The Johnson family, including Mr. Johnson, didn't even greet David and hurriedly left. After everyone had gone, I looked at the man holding the child, hesitant to approach. Could this be my old companion from my previous life? The man glanced at me and turned back to his room. He was so scared that he didn't even come to comfort me.
Is it you, old man? Have you traveled through time too?
David didn't turn around or respond, probably thinking I was talking nonsense. Oh, what is this place? Is the man in front of me the same as the old man from my previous life? Why are so many things different from before? Back in the house, the child and David were already asleep. Having been used to seeing David in his old age, the sight of this handsome young man was a bit unsettling. His face was pale, and he had a faint scent of blood, indicating he was still recovering from serious injuries. I noticed the open window. He must have sneaked in to help me when he saw I was in trouble. I'm still in confinement, and taking care of the little one is already exhausting. Now, I have an older one to look after too. I went to the kitchen to prepare dinner and found it stocked with good things. Seeing the clucking hen made my mouth water.
I wanted to eat chicken, but I didn't know how to handle the lively creature.
In this era, chicken was a rare treat, something you might eat once a year. Even in my previous life, it was the old man who handled the chickens. Fortunately, there were other ingredients. I add the fine pork belly, thinking of making braised pork, but I lacked the necessary ingredients. In the end, I decided to stir-fry some pork with green peppers to satisfy my craving. Just as I finished cutting the meat, I heard a knock on the door. Who could it be at this hour? I opened the courtyard door to see a young man standing there. He was about 17 or 18, thin as a stick, with a clever look on his face. He seemed familiar, but I couldn't place him.
Hello, sister-in-law. I'm Tom, Captain Johnson's orderly.
Oh, it's Tom. No wonder he looked familiar. Wasn't he supposed to be nearly 200 pounds? I remembered seeing him in my previous life, much older and much heavier. Sigh. This really isn't my previous life. I walked dejectedly back to the kitchen. Tom followed me into the kitchen and even helped me prepare dinner.
I helped move these things in and just returned the military vehicle.
He didn't say where he took it, probably because it was a military secret, something the old man always talked about in my previous life. Sigh. I thought of my old man again. I wondered how many years he lived after I passed away and if he suffered when he went. Absent-mindedly, I helped her light the fire. Tom noticed my pale face and insisted I go back to my room to rest. I dragged my feet back to the room and found David already awake, drinking medicine with the tea on the table. A pile of medicine lay in front of him, and he swallowed it all without flinching.
Are you okay?
Whether or not he was my old man, seeing him with that face made my heart ache. Sigh. He was even less like my old companion. My old companion always had a rustic air about him when he was young. It took a lot of effort to cultivate his taste to the point where he had a bit of the refined gentleman look I liked.
I'll take a nap. Call me when the food is ready.
Exhausted, I fell asleep holding my son. I hadn't slept long before I was woken up. Just as I was about to lose my temper, I opened my eyes to see a pair of clear eyes, and I couldn't help but suppress my anger. I had almost married a wanderer shortly after arriving here. Seeing the man in front of me, who looked just like my old companion, I should learn to be content. After all, not everyone could tolerate my temper. At the dining table, I was surprised to see my favorite braised pork. I felt a bit dazed. In my later years, I loved braised pork, but because of high blood pressure, the doctor forbade me from eating it. My old man wouldn't let me touch it. I only got to eat a piece on my 80th birthday, and then I ended up here. There was also old hen soup on the table. Postpartum recovery without chicken soup is soulless. I happily drank the chicken soup but didn't touch the braised pork. My old man said eating too much braised pork was bad for my health. If there was something better to eat, I should save the pork for later. David, perhaps because his wounds hadn't healed, didn't eat the braised pork either. He only had a couple of bites of rice before heading back to his room with a gloomy face. Tom, seeing David leave, ate the meat with even more gusto. He seemed quite afraid of David. I enjoyed the chicken soup. The chicken soup now couldn't compare to what it would be in the future. In the future, you couldn't buy such free-range chickens. The farm-raised chickens had a fishy taste, which I never liked. My old man often cooked chicken with ginseng, and that taste was even harder for me to accept. After eating and drinking my fill, I went back to the room to nurse the baby. David, who had somehow gotten hold of a book, was reading it intently. His quiet demeanor reminded me a bit of my old man in his later years.
What should we name our child?
I had only given him a nickname, Little Stone, but hadn't decided on a formal name.
Samuel.
How do you know it's a boy?
The bundle hadn't been opened, so he hadn't seen the baby's gender. In my previous life, I often talked about my daughter who had passed away.
Isn't it? Isn't the chubby one a boy?
Yes, it's a boy.
I turned over and pulled the blanket over my head, not wanting the man to see me cry. Everything was different. He wasn't my old man. After a few days of good food and rest at home, David's face didn't look as bad as it did initially. But I noticed he had some hearing issues, just like my old man in his later years. Poor guy, so young and already hard of hearing.
It will get better.
I didn't believe him. My old man was very strong-willed. He took a lot of medicine to treat his hearing loss, but it never improved. Eventually, his hearing didn't get better, but he became quite good at reading lips. On the day I finished my confinement period, Margaret brought a few eggs and invited us to her younger son's wedding.
It's rare, but Sarah still married the youngest Johnson boy. Just a while ago, rumors had spread about Sarah's unexpected pregnancy and her alleged affair with a drifter. Despite this, the youngest Johnson boy still married Sarah, which must be true love. David, your brother's wedding dowry is a bit short. Can you contribute some money?
I was seriously injured in the army and need long-term medication. I don't have much money left.
You were injured serving the country. Doesn't the army take care of you?
The country takes care of me, but I'm already disabled and can't return to the army. Will you take care of my wife and child?
How can I take care of them? You ungrateful son.
Margaret seemed afraid David would hold her responsible and fled in a hurry. Over the years, David had sent her quite a bit of money from the army. David watched Margaret flee, his face dark and unreadable. Although David was resting at home, Tom was always out and about, acting mysteriously. Not long after, the police came to the village and took David's sister-in-law away, accusing her of child trafficking. Emily's mother, who was a nurse, usually looked down on people. Those who didn't know better might think her family was a renowned medical family. One day, a car arrived, and a well-dressed middle-aged couple got out, accompanied by a proud young man. I noticed the middle-aged man bore some resemblance to David.
David, we've finally found you.
They explained their purpose, and I learned that these people were David's biological parents. The real Johnson child was born with a congenital heart defect and couldn't survive, so they conspired with a nurse to switch their child with a wealthy family's baby. The nurse who helped with the switch was from Emily's family. This incident was reported, and the truth came out, leading them to find David here. I had thought Margaret disliked David because he was the second child, neither the eldest nor the youngest, and had a difficult personality. David showed no expression upon hearing the news. The visitors felt awkward, but they were delighted to see Little Stone and immediately presented a delicate gold lock to the child.
Although the gold lock was beautiful, I had seen many good things in my previous life. I glanced at David, wondering if he wanted the gift. Seeing him nod slightly, I happily accepted the gold lock and put it on Little Stone.
Sigh. Looking at Little Stone's chubby, bare arms, I felt a bit regretful. When we have more money, I'll buy some gold bells to hang on them. After putting on the gold lock, the atmosphere became a bit cold. Fortunately, Tom had finished preparing the meal. Since we had guests, dinner was quite sumptuous, including my favorite old hen soup. I eagerly opened the soup pot, only to see ginseng floating in it, which made me furious.
Didn't I say not to put ginseng in the soup? How can we drink this with such a strong medicinal taste?
I thought we had distinguished guests and wanted to serve the best.
Oh.
I lost interest and ate other dishes, not touching the chicken soup at all. David glanced at me, his face expressionless, deep in thought. Seeing his look, I remembered the old man's nagging in my past life and felt a bit guilty, shrinking my neck in fear that he might make me drink the unpleasant soup. After dinner, the middle-aged couple talked with David in the room while I strolled in the yard with the baby. The proud young man also came out, offering to take me for a drive.
Would you like to go for a drive?
Forget it. The roads here are too rough, and your car's low chassis might not make it far.
Pregnant and alone, the grief of Michael's loss led to a difficult labor, nearly costing my life. Though I survived, I was left unable to have more children. Whether this was a dream or reality, my sole aim was to save the child within me. The Johnson family had sent me to this old house, isolated from others. In my past life, I was rescued the next morning, too late for proper care. This time, I was determined to save myself. I crawled to the door, desperate for help, and saw Sarah coming with supplies.
Sarah, get help. I'm about to give birth.
Wait here, I'll get Mrs. Thompson.
My heart sank. Shouldn't I be taken to a hospital? Then I remembered, this was 60 years ago, and home births were common. I glanced at the low, damp house. Was I really going to give birth here? My husband had ensured I was well cared for in my later years, living in luxury. Now, I was back in this era of scarcity, starting over. The names on the household registry were changed to David and Samuel for Little Stone.
Old lady, pack up. We're going back to the military district. This time, with the Williams family support, I'll climb even higher.
What did you call me?
Old lady. I should have known. You traveled through time too.
Ugh. The first time we met, I asked if you were a time traveler, and you ignored me.
When I first arrived, I found myself on a mission. I quickly completed it using my past life's memories. But I was ambushed by the enemy at the end, and I was in a coma for half a month in the hospital. When I could finally walk, I rushed back. However, my injury affected my hearing, and for the first few days, I couldn't hear anything and had to read lips.
But you didn't recognize me.
I saw that you kept our child safe, and I suspected you were a time traveler too. But I disguised myself as your favorite appearance, and you didn't like it at all. I also noticed your personality and food preferences changed. I thought you were another Linda from a different space.
When I first arrived, I almost lost my life. If my personality hadn't changed, it would have been strange.
Fortunately, I recognized you during this time. You are indeed my old lady.
By the way, in our past life, didn't we have a daughter? And how did you know you were part of the Williams family?
I only found out the truth in my later years. In our past life, our child was switched. Little Stone was my most outstanding soldier, but by the time I discovered he was my son, he had already sacrificed his life for the country.
I remembered that David had a period of deep depression in our past life. When I asked him why, he said it was a state secret.
Why didn't you tell me?
You had finally moved on. How could I dare tell you? All the people involved had passed away by then. Even if I wanted revenge, I couldn't find anyone. It was also then that I discovered my true identity, but the Williams couple had already passed away, so I never thought of changing my surname to Williams.
Thankfully, in this life, we made up for the regrets of our past life. David is even more capable in this life, and he has given me a life of luxury once again. Ah, what a simple and unpretentious life of contentment.